What I do want to do now is introduce to you, I think, one of the most innovative educational world entrepreneurs, James Tooley. I think you will see in James Tooley a man who is by himself almost transforming many cultures throughout the world and really the world itself by bringing education, specifically private education, to a whole new kind of global accessibility that we haven't seen before. He wrote a book called The Beautiful Tree, a book which espouses a model which he and many others have implemented throughout the world that is literally leading millions of people to educational access they never had before. In fact, the book was so influential it won the Sir Anthony Fisher Prize in Great Britain and several other prizes internationally. Additionally, James puts his, as it were, his work and his money where his words are, his mouth is, and he has started 3 significant educational institutions to bring that private education in developing countries. He's got the Cadmus Academies in Honduras. He also started the Omega Schools in Ghana, and he's also started the Cadmus education in India. And this is just, kind of the tip of the iceberg. He's also a patron of the a foundation called Formidable Education, which has united 5,000 schools involving 1 million students in Nigeria, right? This is one of the most populous countries in the world. I mean, this is really a super innovator, a really interesting guy who also happens to be a professor there at University of Newcastle, and he's a research fellow for the Independent Institute here, and so in the United States. And so it's with a really great honor, pleasure that I welcome James Tooley to our podium.
Thank you very much, Father. I hardly recognize myself from that warm introduction.
So humble, I assure you.
Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, I've been doing a lot of traveling lately, and on one of my flights, we waited at the gate for 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, before finally we were airborne. And when we were flying, I asked the air hostess what the problem had been, and she said, "Oh, no problem. The pilot was bothered by some noises from the engine. And it took us a while to find a new pilot." And the moral of this story, ladies and gentlemen, the moral of this story is too often in education, we tinker, we find a new pilot when instead we should be looking at the system. We should be looking at the engine. And what I want to talk to you, the slides are so far away, can you see them? Anyway, I've got lots of visuals, I hope you can see them. Malala, you all know Malala, don't you? She was the youngest person ever to win the Nobel Peace Prize. The story you all know as well. She was on her way to school when she was shot by the Taliban. But there's something missing in the account of her that is odd to me. You've probably filled in the details when you hear the international agencies, the BBC and others describing her story, and you filled in the details. She was on her way to public school, and her father, the headmaster of the public school, and she was shot. That's not true at all. She was on her way to the school that her father had created. He was an educational entrepreneur. He had created a low-cost private school, and she was on her way to private school. And this is a phenomenon that is all over the world. I discovered it for myself 17 years ago. I was in Hyderabad, and I was on a consultancy from the International Finance Corporation. I'd become an expert on private education. And we all know, don't we, that private education is about the rich. Private education is about the elite. My mission in life, for reasons that this conference will understand, I think, was to serve the poor. And here I was, an expert on private education, which is about the rich. So how do you bring those two things together? I went into the slums of the old city of Hyderabad, and the parts of my life were brought together. I found a low-cost private school. In those days, charging about $1, $2 per month. And then I found another and another. And soon I was in access with a federation of 500 of these low-cost private schools. I spoke to parents, mostly Muslim mothers in this part of Hyderabad. And I said, well, why do you send your children to private school when the government school is free and you get free books and free lunch to boot? And mother after mother told me the same story. In the public schools, the government schools, our children are abandoned. And I went to see one of these public schools. I went with the district education officer. They knew we were coming. And he was incredibly candid. We arrived there, and there were 130 kids in a class on the floor, sitting there amongst the mosquitoes. These bright, bushy-eyed kids wanting to learn, really keen to see this visitor, but doing nothing. Day after day doing nothing because the teachers in the government schools had abandoned them. There were only 2 teachers present that day, and as Malala relates in her book about government schools in Pakistan, there were only 2 teachers in that sort of school every day. The other teachers had a rota. They even had a rota to say when they could come and when they could leave their children abandoned. I came back to Washington, D.C., to the World Bank IFC headquarters here. I thought there was something quite incredible going on here in poor areas, these low-cost private schools. I came back and wanted to tell people about this, and all they said was, calm down, Tooley, calm down. You've seen maybe a couple of businessmen ripping off the poor. I thought, ripping off the poor? They're staying weekends and doing science fairs and sports fairs for these kids. They're doing extra work. But no, the idea was dismissed. So I thought there was something going on here. So I managed to get funding from the John Templeton Foundation. And I went out to see if this phenomenon existed elsewhere. And we went to places like Makoko in Lagos. So visitors to Nigeria, to Lagos, when you get off at the airport, you go to Victoria Island, probably. That's where the posh hotels are. And you go across Third Main Bridge, and you might see down there in the water, Makoko, this shanty town built on stilts into these dark waters of the Lagos Lagoon. And I was passing that way myself on the way to Victoria Island on my first visit, and I said, that's where I want to go. That's where I want to find low-cost private schools. And my host said, it's too dangerous. You can't go there. So the next day I went without him, and we drove in the taxi and took me to the edge of the shanty town. The taxi took me there, and he said, I can't go beyond here. It's too dangerous. So I went in a canoe and went around there and soon found some children. I had a video, and I didn't think I could share it with these screens so far apart, but I got a video of meeting the first kids in that shanty town. And the little girl, Sandra, we asked her where she goes to school, and she says, KPS. And I said, what does that stand for? She says, Kennedy. Kennedy what? Kennedy Private School. And so it's not Kennedy as in your erstwhile president, but it's Kennedy in a Nigerian name. And that was one of 32 private schools we found in that shanty town alone. Or I went to Kenya, to Nairobi, to the slum called Kibera, perhaps one of the most famous slums in the world. And there, when you come across a boy like Frank here, before I started doing this research, people would assume, he goes to public school or he's out of school altogether. But no, go with him down into the slum and you'll find that he's there at a tiny little private school right in the center of the slum, one of nearly 100 private schools in that slum itself. Nearly 100 private schools. And then all around the world, this is a global phenomenon. Rural China. I was giving a talk at a conference like this in Beijing. And if any of you have been to Beijing recently, you'll realize how rich it is. But I said, well, Nigeria, India, there are these low-cost private schools serving poor communities. Could this be the same in China? And people were a bit embarrassed by the question, to be honest. And then someone from the British aid agency, DFID, put his hand up from the floor and said, we work. DFID works in the poorest parts of China, Gansu province in the northwest. And we are we're working in the poorest villages, and we can tell you categorically there are no low-cost private schools there. So this was a bit of a red rag to this bull. And I went back to Newcastle, and as luck would have it, or as he was saying in this conference hall, as Providence would have it, a student arrived from China, and I asked where he was from. He said, from Gansu province. I said, do you mind if we go to Gansu province? I've got something we want to look for there together. So this student, Liu Chang, you can see him there. He's now a professor at Beijing Normal University. We went looking. We got up early in the morning, talked to mothers in markets, and we got some directions. Yes, there could be private schools here or there. We abandoned our vehicle. It was suitable only for three-wheelers. We went traveling into the mountains where people were doing harvesting like they've been doing for hundreds of years. And sure enough, at the end of this route, we came across a low-cost private school, People's Hearts, Mingjing, where the children sang in a choir to me, don't turn your eyes on these beautiful people. And it was one of 586 low-cost private schools in the mountains of Gansu, which no one knew about, and everyone you spoke to even denied their existence. So this is an extraordinary picture. Just how many are there? There's a chart there. Lagos State is perhaps the most studied for private schools, Lagos State in Nigeria. There are 14,000 low-cost private schools there. 70% of children in Lagos State go to private school. Only 26% are in government schools. And in fact, that figure is typical across the urban developing world. New Delhi, Hyderabad, Nairobi, Accra in Ghana, about 70% of the kids will be in private schools, including poor kids in low-cost private schools. And in the rural areas, surveys show that it's about 30%. In South Asia, and my guess it's true in West Africa too. So this is a huge phenomenon, and the phenomenon has great social impact. I could show you lots of tables, but you can just believe me for now that study after study shows that the children in the low-cost private schools outperform those in the public schools when all the proper statistical controls are done, and they outperform them for a fraction of the cost. So this is something really to celebrate. There's also social impact. So I could show you table after table of the schools in West Africa and different parts of the world where there's gender parity in the private schools. Gender parity. But even in communities like parts of rural Pakistan where Malala goes to school or went to school, where you've got private schools in a village, the gender gap between those in and out of school narrows from 16 percentage points to 8 percentage points in the villages where there are private schools. So this is just an extraordinary success story that's going on in different parts of the world. When I started talking about this, first of all, there were lots of people in denial, lots of critics. People can be quite aggressive when you touch on 65 years of development dogma and say the poor are helping themselves in different ways to what you expected. But one of the criticisms I did take to heart, people told me, well, you've looked at Kenya, you looked at Ghana, India. These are not the world's poorest places. You can't really say private schools are good for the poor, as one of my publications said. I took this seriously, Father. I took this seriously, and I said, okay, where are the world's most difficult places? And perhaps they're like Somalia here, where I took this picture of an abandoned tank. Perhaps they're like Somalia. Perhaps they are the war-torn places in Africa. And this is I went to Somaliland in the north of Somalia, and this is a functioning low-cost private school, the 17th May Institute for Maths and Languages, a functioning private school in a bombed-out building. Went to Sierra Leone shortly after the war, and these are children of stonebreakers. You know, the big stones are broken by their mothers and fathers into smaller stones, and their big brothers, and the smaller stones are sold to build roads and airfields around the world. And they went to private school as well, shortly after the war, in the most primitive conditions you can see. But the private schools came in and flourished. And in Liberia, I went to 5 of the largest slums of Monrovia in Liberia. They had great names. One was called West Point, nothing to do with your academy, I don't think. Another was called Doe Community. There was one called Chicken Soup Factory. No prizes for guessing why it was called that. Another was called Red Light. Now, you'd be wrong to guess. You'd be wrong. That was named after the functioning traffic light in Monrovia. But in these communities, again, private school after private school, including this one here, I said to my guide, "Oh, the Americans will love a picture of this school." And he said innocently, "Well, who's Ronald Reagan?" He said. Private school after private school. But and so this is just something to celebrate. This is something extraordinary, and this is a picture of children in a low-cost private school in rural Ghana celebrating. And really, that's what I've been doing ever since about this. But why? Let's just be clear on one issue. Remember that I told you about the parents in India saying their children are abandoned in the government schools. This is a picture across the developing world, in poor areas. Not to say there are not some good government schools, of course there are. But across the developing world, parents see their children being abandoned in the government schools. Now, we made a film for the BBC in Makoko, that shanty town built on stilts that I showed you pictures of. We were filming in Kennedy Private School and others. And then we got permission to film in the public school, the government school. And we again announced. We went with the Deputy Minister of Education. And the BBC cameraman was there, and the very first classroom we went in, the teacher was fast asleep at his desk, and there was a little girl teaching the class. And in the next class, there was no teacher. And then most of the teachers were sitting outside in the shade, and they'd set some work for their kids, and they were eating peanuts, drinking tea, and that sort of thing. And I would not have shown this poor fellow on the BBC film, and I would not have shown it to an audience like this in Lagos, Nigeria, with the Minister of Education present, if it hadn't been something that you see all the time and that breaks your heart when you're going to poor communities. You see this sort of thing going on, children abandoned, but then, thank God, in the private schools, there's energetic teaching. Now, this conference is about good profit, and all the data I've told you so far, I've talked about private schools rather sort of running, rather being rather loose with my definition. Are they for-profit or non-profit? As Iqbal said, non-government or... I like that definition, by the way. I always have to fight with the international community now. I call these schools private, but following what Iqbal said earlier, the development experts, they don't call them private, they call them non-state providers. Anyway, but we've done work now, and we've looked at how many of the schools are actually profit and non-profit. And this is data from the schools we found in the slums of Monrovia itself. Now, I don't know if you can read that, but basically the largest chunk, 61% of the schools we found were for profit. That is, they were owned by a proprietor, and any surplus would come back to the proprietor, him or herself, rather than go to any other organization. There's only a tiny number of government schools there, but you see there's this next largest group was the private independent churches. They were the typical evangelical type churches you see in these poor communities, typically set up by a person, a pastor, who then runs a school, and then the private established churches like the Catholic Church, the Episcopalian, the Wesleyan in Monrovia, they make up about 13.4% of the schools. So we have a picture. The private schools are, majority of them, and this is typical in our studies, the largest number of them, or the majority of them, are for profit. And in the Liberia Household Survey, just to remind us of that figure, 71% of the children are in private schools, even in the poorest slums in Monrovia, one of the, I guess, the poorest slums in the world. You can look at how these private schools are affordable. This is one of their virtues. This is looking again at the for-profit schools. Yes, there are fees that are expensive. So when you're thinking about the poor, people say, how can this idea be pro-poor if the children have to pay fees in the schools. Well, children have to pay fees, and yes, if you look at that graph there, you'll see that the fees at the private schools are many times more than the small levies that are charged in the government school. The blue is the government schools, the red is the private schools. But going to school, there's not only fees you have to pay if you're poor, if you're anyone. You have to buy shoes if you're poor. You have to buy uniform. You have to buy books. You have to pay transport. All these other extra costs. And if you add those in, if you see the middle set of bars there, the cost of sending a child to a private school for the other costs actually is the same as the cost of the other costs in a government school. Not surprisingly, the uniform, books, they all cost about the same. So if you add those things together, the fees and the other costs, you see the combined fees there. And yes, sending a child to a private school is more expensive, but the cost to a parent of sending a child to a government school turns out, a typical figure we found, about 75% of the cost of sending a child to a private school. In other words, these schools are affordable, and they're not much less affordable than sending a child to a supposedly free government school. I've mentioned churches in Monrovia, and it might be worth, for this audience especially, showing that the established church schools, the Catholic schools, the Wesleyan schools, in the poor areas, they don't actually necessarily charge fees that are cheaper, as you would expect, than the for-profit proprietor-driven schools. In fact, the proprietor-driven schools, we found the median fee was about 4,000 Liberian dollars a year, compared to nearly 5,000 in the established church schools. Indeed, my slide has slipped there, I think, but the green, I got a green area, a blue, and a red area there. The red area shows where a church has set up a school and there's no relationship in terms of funding between it. The blue area, which is about 34%, that shows what we expect to happen, doesn't it? A church in a poor area has set up a school, and the church subsidizes the school to some extent. But the green area shows something quite unexpected, I think, to many people. The green area shows where, and it's about 18% of the schools we found, that shows where the church has set up a school, but the school subsidizes the church. There's no philanthropic relationship from church to school. The church is actually a bit of a money earner for the church itself. This is a map of Juba. You can see the White Nile there, the river down the end there. And I just want, this is really to show you that I've been very busy, this map. But if we are able to locate each of those schools carefully, and based on our knowledge of Juba, there's a young chap here who was in Juba. I spoke to him yesterday. If you remember Juba, and you'll see that the for-profit schools, the yellow, are actually in the most difficult places to reach, the most deprived areas. The non-profits are also there to a certain extent. The government schools are in the easy areas. They're in the city centre. They're in the safe, easy areas. In other words, for-profit schools reach the parts other schools do not reach. I think there was a beer advert, something like that once. Now, finally, on this evidence from the for-profit versus the non-profit, this again is from South Sudan. And this graph shows the number of schools that are there, and the red line going down shows when the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, was declared in 2005 in South Sudan. And as you can see from that graph, the number of schools increased quite a lot after the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was declared. Terrific. We can disaggregate all those schools, and we get this rather messy graph here, where that shows the private proprietor schools, the non-government schools, the community, the church, and various other, and the government schools itself. So you can see there's quite an interesting picture there, but the two that are most interesting, if you take them out, are the private proprietor schools, the for-profit schools, and the church schools. And what's been happening there? You've got a peace dividend. You've got a peace dividend of, yes, churches coming in and opening schools, but even more so, private proprietors coming in and opening schools They are the largest number. They are serving more of the poor than anyone else. So I could carry on about the virtues of the for-profit sector, but in the remainder of my time, I just want to talk about what happens when outsiders get involved in this. Father said some kind words at the beginning of this, but since my research and since the publication of The Beautiful Tree, there has been a movement going on, a movement emerging, and lots of outsiders are getting involved in the low-cost education space now. As was pointed out, I've created a couple of co-founded a few chains of schools myself. Omega Schools in Ghana, based just outside Accra in the community called Kaswa, which is on the Cape Coast, on the road to Cape Coast, as Cardinal will know. I co-founded a chain of schools, and very quickly we grew to 38 schools with nearly 20,000 children. We were focusing on the poor communities, and very soon we realized that the cash flow of the poor is daily. So most of our mothers were daily traders. Many of the fathers were absent. But if they were working, they would also be daily paid, or laborers, daily paid laborers, for instance. And we talked to parents, and they said to us, the private schools, we want to send our children to private school. But the private schools, even for the poor, they charge fees termly every 3 months. So even though the fees might only be $5 to $7 per month, you've got to save up $15 to $20 to pay the fees. And if you're poor, it's always hard to save up money. You know, there's always other calls on your income. And if you're poor, then you pay the fees, and then you get hit by other costs, the PTA fees, you've got to buy uniforms. So we listened to those problems and said, okay, why don't we create an all-inclusive daily fee? We worked out the total cost of schooling over the year, including uniform, books, transport, lunch, etc., and we divided it by the number of days in the school year, and the parents could come and pay that fee per day. This was amazingly popular. When we first opened our schools, hundreds of parents wanted to come there. It's amazingly popular and terrible to administer. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. But slowly we got used to different ways of organizing it, and eventually we've got vendors in the community. They come to our head office, they buy, what's really a currency, get into Omega school cards, and then they sell them in the community, including at the school gate in the morning, so we can be cash free. And we also give them 1.5% commission, so we again create new jobs in the communities. That's been very successful. Bridge, I've been very quiet about, but Bridge International Academies is now the largest chain of schools anywhere in the world. The co-founder, Jay Kilmerman, came to see me after I'd published this idea of chains of low-cost private schools. He came to see me, and I recommended he open in Kenya, and they're now 150,000 children around the world. Tremendously successful. And then I've created a couple of brands, the Cadmus brands, as Father mentioned. There's one in Honduras, Cadmus Academies, and Cadmus Education in India. Cadmus Education, a couple of years old, we've got 6,000 kids who are going to grow to about 50,000 hopefully soon. And Cadmus in Honduras, just a year old, we've got 2 schools there in poor areas of Tegucigalpa. But let me finish by, first of all, just summarizing 2 things that occurred to me at 4 o'clock in the morning, suffering from jet lag. You know, when outsiders get involved, I mean, this is trite in a way, but it's worth stating, profit is good in these businesses if any profit is reinvested in the education business in order to further improve the educational and social impact already found in the sector, the sort of things I've been describing already. But it's also true, of course, that any profit is good if it's used as a signal to potential investors that the business is worth investing in to further improve the environment. So in other words, profit to me is good, whether you give it in dividends or you reinvest it. So that much is clear, I think. But there are some problems when outsiders get involved. And the first one is definitely, it's a mea culpa, really. It's some people, like myself, perhaps got involved in the sector in order to prove the point. I wanted to prove something about the role of education, the role of government in education. You know, I was a philosopher of education. I wanted to prove some point about the role of government in education. And I was not really focused enough on profit. Too little focus on profit, I think, if you're in the for-profit business, can be a danger, almost as much as too much focus on profit. I can discuss this one-on-one afterwards, but it's a bit like, to me, it's just, I didn't really care if the business was evaluated at $500,000 or $1 million. It didn't matter to me. It mattered very much to the business partners I was taking on this journey. I didn't really care if I put some money in and didn't sign a particular document. It mattered very much when later people are trying to work out what goes where in a business. So too little emphasis on profit can be bad as well. But some of the big providers are coming in are picking unnecessary fights with regulators, and this is a serious problem. Let me finish by talking about regulations. These are perhaps one of the chief impediments in the private school market. Fortunately, regulations are bad on schools, but there are federations of low-cost private school providers that have been created to fight some of these regulations. And this is a wonderful federation in Nigeria, the Association, it's a great Nigerian name, the Association of Formidable Education Development. This is the one that's got 5,000 members with nearly 1 million kids. And in case you can't spot me, I'm the one in the middle of that photograph. And we're fighting, and it's just come up, we've got to fight another fight. Rivers State in Nigeria now, the oil-rich state, the governor there wants to close 2,000 private schools. Another fight is on, another struggle to try and convince them that these schools are worth protecting. And I seem to be engaged in fights all the time here. This is in India, in Punjab. The Punjab government is closing 2,000 low-cost private schools. So I was given this ceremonial dagger, and I held it aloft, perhaps unwisely, saying, we will fight. We will fight the government in closing these schools. But let me close by saying, yes, this is the most exciting business to be involved in, the most exciting journey to be involved in. It's not always easy. This is in Honduras, in a very poor community. If you know Central America, the gangs are there, and this area was in Gang 18 territory. I think it's named after the 18th of November. And you could tell that because the gang throws tennis shoes over all the wires, and so you know that territory. Anyway, here we're just talking to the mothers about opening this new, very low-cost private school in this community, and we had a picture because all the mothers said they would send their children to this school. And then they sent me this photograph. He did that red circle. He said, "Did you see the guy behind you?" I said, "No." And so I enlarged the photograph, and there is the guy behind me. He's a gang member going like this. Can you see him on the photograph? I don't know what that sign means, but I assume he was saying, "You're very welcome in the community." That's what I took from that. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
That was terrific. James, you're amazing. Social entrepreneurship on steroids. Oh, James, I want to thank you very, very much. First of all, for the complete inspiration. Beyond the message about profit, I mean, you're just social entrepreneurship on steroids. I mean, we just love it. I think, my huge takeaway is, does profitability work in the private sector in education? Absolutely. And he's proven the thesis worldwide with this extraordinary effort. And I think it just brings to the fore that, profit does lead to the good when you can sort of resist all of these government regulations, resist the corruption, resist the gangs and so forth, as he's tried to do by creating or helping to create these federations. But also, it shows how education can help these educational models, because in the beautiful tree he does, he has kind of refined a model for private education federations, private education financing, daily financing. That, of course, this is what normal entrepreneurs are trying to do, and he's done it for the poor, and he's done it out of the goodness of his heart. And I just think if there are outsiders who want to invest in this, talk to James Tooley, because I think this is probably one of the most worthwhile efforts in the world to bringing the poor literally not only out of their poverty, but to the creativity of good profit. So thank you very, very much, James, for a totally edifying talk.